Good morning and a very warm welcome everybody here in the auditorium at SAIS and at the screen wherever you might join us. My name is Andreas Rödder. I am the current Helmut Schmidt Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, which is a highly impressive title, I have to say. And I'm delighted to welcome two distinguished, don't want to say guests, to the dean of this school, but two distinguished and outstanding participants on this podium. First, Ambassador Emily Haber is one of the top German diplomats. She was political director and then permanent Undersecretary of State in the German Foreign Office and then in the German Ministry of the Interior during the migration crisis in 2015 and 16. Since 2018, she has been the German ambassador to the US, and her term has just been renewed for another year. And furthermore, please let me take the liberty as a historian to draw your attention to her historical dissertation about the German Panther's leap to Agadir in 1911, which means Emily Haber is theoretically as well as practically well experienced with crisis diplomacy with all its different outcomes. Then I'm grateful to welcome Dean James Steinberg. He has done what I envy the US for this elegant moving between academia and politics. Just to name a few political functions, he was director of the State Department's policy planning staff and Deputy National Security Advisor to President Clinton from 1996 to 2000 and Deputy Secretary of State between 2009 and 2011. He has been University Professor of Social Science, International Affairs and Law, and he has been Dean of the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Most recently, he has written about the US-China relations. And last year, he has become the 10th Dean of SAIS. We originally planned this podium for late 21 or early 22 originally. Due to the pandemic, we had to postpone it. In late 2021, we might have discussed the international consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. We might have discussed the new German government, Annalena Baerbock's concept of feminist foreign policy, or Heather Conley's article about Germany after Merkel will pursue neutral foreign policy and thereby intensify transatlantic differences, as she wrote in November last year. In early 2022, we might have discussed such German neutrality and the intensified transatlantic differences while Putin was militarily building up at the eastern flank of Ukraine. But then the German ambassador in Washington wrote a cable starting with the famous words, Berlin, wir haben ein Problem, Berlin, we are having a problem. 1 month later, she wrote this on the 24th of January, 1 month later, Putin invaded Ukraine, and 5 weeks later, the German chancellor announced the so-called Zeitenwende, change of times in Germany. So this panel, in fact, takes place in a different world, not only in a world where Putin and Russia have invaded Ukraine, but where we are facing mass murder and war crimes on a really unexpected level. So my first question to the ambassador as the game changer, how did you experience the Zeitenwende in Germany?
Did you mean to imply I was a game changer? Because obviously I wasn't.
But it was an enormously important contribution, I think.
A confidential one, as cables are. But it's true. I think the days around the 24th of February will be considered as possibly rivaling as turning point the November 1989. As a turning point, and there in 1989 and the years that followed, what really changed was the environment. What didn't necessarily change were the traditions of strategic thinking. And this is precisely what changed now in the context of the Zeitenwende speech, the sea change speech of the German Chancellor. Axioms of German strategic thinking were jettisoned overnight, among which we don't export weapons to war areas, war zones, or conflict regions. Jettisoned. We want to become, as quickly as we possibly can, completely independent from the import of Russian hydrocarbons. Jettisoned the axiom that interdependence would actually be conducive to stability. That had been a firm axiom, a firm conviction of German energy and security strategies over many decades. It's now obvious that that cannot be trusted anymore. It's been the evidence is out there that actually being dependent on Russia can be weaponized and can be a threat to security. And the German Chancellor in his speech has acknowledged that. To reach the 2% goal by the end of the year and to install a permanent fund enshrined in the Constitution amounting up to 110 billion US dollars. All of that amounts to tectonic shift in German security and in German energy and in German foreign policy.
Dean Steinberg, would you have expected this German reaction to what happened in Ukraine?
Yes, but for the following reason, which is that I don't think I would have expected both parts, which is I would have expected, as the crisis began to unfold, a very cautious approach by the German government. But I think once it happened, I think that Germany's own historic experience made it hard for Germany to simply sit back and not do anything, right? I mean, I think that the reflection that's taken place over the past 70 years in terms of the consequences and the nature of European security made it hard once Russia just so blatantly violated the basic principles under which both the post-World War II order was created and then the post-Cold War order was created, that it just became impossible. And I think that that's what's been so dramatic about this whole event is that Putin made it easy in some respects. There were a lot of different strategies that could have been pursued, as we saw in 2014, which would have made it harder for Germany and others to take a very powerful stance. But this sort of blatant, direct violation of fundamental principles of the organization of our international order just made it hard for anyone, I think, who had any commitment to these things to stand back. And I think that's why, in the end, although it was the right thing to do, I don't think there was a serious choice. And I think, and obviously as events have unfolded, it became clear why this was the necessary choice. So I think that one will have to question the point about why did Putin make it so easy for others to rally against him. But I think the way it was done made it clear that Germany really didn't have a choice, which is not to say it wasn't a good thing to have done, but I just think, I don't think it was a surprise.
We'll get back to Putin. Just let me step in there for 1 second regarding the German reaction. So a really severe debate has evolved in Germany at the moment. Political scientist Stefan Bierling wrote a kind of j'accuse in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung about the great German self-betrayal about foreign politics. And he wrote, in less than half an hour, Chancellor Scholz abandoned a whole arsenal of German life lies, understanding Putin, appeasing dictators, ruinating armed forces, illusions of change through trade and ideologies such as no arms delivery to conflict areas or violence is not a solution were out, and in came supporting attacked states with armament, 100 billion euros for the Bundeswehr, observing the 2% target and enforcing the rule of law with military strength. So, as I said, a really severe debate has come up. German President and former Foreign Secretary Frank-Walter Steinmeier has admitted severe mistakes of German politics, his politics in the last years, and even German Chancellor Merkel, former German Chancellor Merkel, is under severe criticism for her politics. So, what would you say? Why did it take Germany so long to realize that Russia was a threat? We could have seen Chechnya, we could have seen Syria, we could have seen 2008 Georgia and the Crimea. So what would you say? Why did it take so long in Germany?
Well, I think I would refute the premise of your question. It's true that the speech of the Chancellor and the decisions that ensued constitute a sea change. But your question seems to imply that we had been totally Pollyanna-ish in the years that preceded it, and that's simply not true. It's fair to say that Germany has been a trailblazer for sanctions in 2014. They wouldn't have happened without us and without the former German, the then German Chancellor actually fighting for them. There was a great deal of reticence among European partners at the time too. We've been tough on sanctions. Whatever happened on MH17, was it? The Salisbury murders, the Navalny attempted murder, the Kerch incidents, etc. So while it is true that German policy, at least a considerable segment of the German political class, believed that interdependence could contribute to stability and predictability, they were by no means ignorant or Pollyanna-ish about the nature of the Russian threat and the series of ruthless actions that Russia had taken ever since the August War in 2008. So my argument would be we have thrown overboard a number of fundamental principles that were relevant to German foreign policy on stability, on independence, on sending weapons to conflict areas. And it was the monumental the outrageousness of a war in Europe that tapped into memories of another devastating war in Europe in the same geography that actually facilitated a government that is constituted at least of two fundamentally pacifist parties to take decisions on hard security and on hard military security.
In Steinberg, the Russian war against Ukraine uses, as we all see, brute violence in an unprecedented manner, and is at odds with everything we would have expected for warfare and politics in the 21st century. Even for warfare, we would have expected much more cyber hybrid wars, so it might be hybrid, but it's using analogous force in an unexpected manner. Would you say, is 19th century great power politics, 19th century, 20th century military politics back on stage? Do we have to reorient, to recalibrate our expectations of international politics and the use of force and violence in international politics?
So it's a difficult question because we don't yet know and may not know for some time what the calculus was in the Kremlin behind this. I mean, because they're as we're all historians here, and we think about sort of what are the possible theories of the case that might have driven this. And, you know, we're all speculating now, so I'll just do a little speculating without knowing anything because we don't yet know. But my sense is that for a variety of reasons, that Putin believed that Ukraine was easy pickings, that he could move in, that Ukraine was not a serious state, that there was not serious loyalty to the state, that the Zelensky government was a puppet of the West and a former comedian that would just kind of evaporate in response to the and that a bold move by Russia would lead to a quick victory. And so if that's right, then what presumably happened was it was a miscalculation, and that once in, that the Russians were actually totally unprepared for actually having to successfully execute a military campaign, and they fell back on what they do and did in Chechnya and did in other conflicts, which is just to use kind of very crude tactics and attacks on civilians and the like, because they didn't really have a meaningful plan. If that's right, then it doesn't necessarily tell us that this is sort of coming back. It tells us a lot about the decision making that was taken in the Kremlin, how poorly informed Putin was, the kind of the fantasies that have been created around this denial of Ukrainian identity, denial of Ukrainian sovereignty, denial of the view that Zelensky represented something that the Ukrainian people wanted. So I think before we make judgments and make sort of sweeping assessments that, oh, well, you know, the old-fashioned 19th century warfare is back, we need to look at the particulars of this case and think about whether it is relatively distinctive to the unique circumstances prevailing in the Kremlin and the conceptions that drove Putin and his very insular group of advisors, as opposed to a broad generalization about the state of international affairs.
So you spoke about miscalculation. You, Mrs. Ambassador, you know Moscow very well, have been there at the German embassy. Of course, you had to deal with Russia as a Secretary of State and during all your career in the Foreign Office. How do you explain Putin's politics? Is this kind of Tsarist imperial attitude of Greater Russia? And even more the question, can you imagine that Putin just miscalculated? I'm really struggling to think that someone like Putin could just have miscalculated before starting that war. So we know this from history, that people do utterly miscalculate. But would you think that this might be an explanation that he just miscalculated?
Well, first I join Dean Steinberg in saying we know actually very little on the dynamics of the inner circle of the Russian president. Very little. We don't know where he draws his advice from. We don't know how decisions evolve. So let's be very cautious and let's not try to dive into psychology. I think it gets us wrong. Let's just look at the facts. And the facts are, he's written an article summer last year. Unfortunately, no one reacted internationally to it. He didn't receive a response. I do consider that a mistake. And in this article, he clearly said that he didn't consider Ukraine a sovereign state, that Ukraine did not have an identity, that it was always part of Russia. He laid claim on Ukraine, saying it did not deserve a national identity. He practically told the rest of the world that here was an option and he might go for it, and he didn't receive an answer. So in a way, I would consider this a return of ethno-nationalist thinking, very much in the mold of the 19th and the 20th century, albeit with weapons of the 21st century. Did he miscalculate? Everything indicates to the assumption, which was an assumption in the West too, that he believed that this would be a war of only several days, that Russia would quickly prevail, and that Ukraine would nearly immediately implode. Again, he believed that this country did not have, and its people did not have an identity, were essentially Russian. So he seems to have assumed that there would be no major fight. And the defiant resistance of Ukraine has certainly come as a surprise, as has come as a surprise the degree of Western alignment, our alignment in a sense of purpose and sense of unity in responding to the Russian onslaught.
Which brings up an interesting historical insight. Even in 2022, obviously there is still continuation of, on the one hand, ignoring what people are writing. Nobody took Hitler's Mein Kampf seriously. Nobody took Mao's Red Bible for serious. And the same is true for Putin. This is the one thing still continuing, obviously, in 2022. And the second is that leaders of war obviously tend to miscalculate, to hope for an easy winning, for a quick war, which ends in an utter bloodshed and perhaps in the opposite. So it was the leader Croesus in the Greek antique times who was told by the oracle that he was, if he waged that war, he was going to lead a big empire, and he did not realize that he was meant himself. So, but I think this is what really strikes me as a historian. So this long continuation until today. Now, the Western world is struggling with the dilemma between supporting attacked Ukraine and preventing an escalation of that war. But particularly now, after the discovery of these obvious mass murders in Ukraine, again, there is the question on the table. Are there red lines? And if so, what are they? What would you say, both?
Look, if you define red lines, as we know from history, you tell the opponent how far he can go, or she can go. So beware of red lines, and if you define them, make sure that you actually do what you have told the other side to do. We have been all along during this sanction debate before the war broke out. We were utterly prepared, you know. We had started to work in the transatlantic context, Americans and Europeans, on sanctions and on sanction concepts and packages as early as January. But we never said publicly what precisely we were going to do. This was the reason why the German Chancellor and German politicians for so long didn't even mention Nord Stream 2, although it was evident that Nord Stream 2 would be dead in the event of a military operation or in the event of a major war. And I think it's a clever step to keep the initiative and not handing over the possibility of the initiative to the other side by preparing to sanctions. So I'm not a fan of red lines. I'm not a fan of telling the other side what to expect.
But can't
Can I
you
just
yeah,
come in
but
on this?
the only
Because
question
I
is,
think this is,
Yep.
you know, for our students, this is a really important question, right? And it's heavily debated in the literature. It goes back to Tom Schelling and we've all learned about the whole issues around deterrence, because I completely agree with the ambassador that there are risks, as our lawyer friends, that expressio unis et exclusio alteris, which is if you draw one red line, then you say everything up to that is okay. At the same time, that if there's ambiguity about your response, it makes deterrence harder. And I think we saw this in this particular case when President Biden, who's I think handled this admirably in most respects, made that observation briefly about, well, a small intervention wouldn't be, you know, that was, you know, made everybody very nervous. But I want to come to what I think now is the new decisive moment we have just crossed, which is, and goes to this red line question, which is the decision to characterize the Russian behavior as war crimes, I think is a profound issue about a red line, because the question then becomes, what can you do after a country has committed war crimes? We saw this in the Balkans. We were talking about the Balkans before. Once you and we've seen this in other cases, in Africa and other places where we've determined that war crimes have taken place, how can you then imagine a circumstance in which you, let's say the Russians withdraw and they come back, even if the status quo ante is restored, they say, well, never mind, right? And so I do think that this question now, by having decided to explicitly characterize the Russian behavior as war crimes, has crossed the red line, and either we mean something consequential about it, or the whole idea of war crimes is going to become quite. So I do think this is a place where the red line issue is powerfully posed.
I need to go into that because I agree. And I did not want to insinuate by saying, beware of defining red lines, that the option could be on the table that we just return to the status quo ante should the war end in agreement, in an agreement, say, between Ukraine and Russia. I said this before to your students. This is a war between Russia and Ukraine, yes, but it's also about our security. And it's about democracy too, because after all, we are supportive of Ukraine, an aspiring democracy that has been subject to a monumental military aggression. And in that sense, it's also a confrontation between autocracies and democracies. The aggressor is a country deeply contemptuous of international law and of rules and values that define us. It's also about us. So imagining that we just return to a normal relationship with a country that has done all that, no. So on that, I totally agree with you. I'm just saying we're not going to say what precisely we're going to do on day X should the Russian do X, Y. That's all I meant.
You mentioned, Jim, mentioned President Biden's utterances. In another speech, in his speech in Warsaw, he called for regime change in Russia. So this comment has been widely criticized. However, some would argue that in such times, calling out the obvious might be politically advantageous. May I ask you, as a completely independent academic, what you thought or what comment you have on these utterances of President Biden about the question of regime change?
Well, so you'll know the administration insists that's not what the president said. So I just have to, you have to acknowledge that that's their view, and of course President Biden is the only one who can answer what he had in his mind when he said those things. But so rather than saying what President Biden said, I think we should talk about the general issue, which is whether under these circumstances the right answer is regime change. And I think the problem here is, and this is what the administration wants Biden to have said, whether he intended it or not, is simply to say that that on the one hand, that this behavior is simply unacceptable. On the other hand, once you call for regime change, then your credibility is put in play. And if you're not able to execute on that, you better not call for it. So my view is you may decide that that is the right answer, but don't decide it unless you're prepared to do whatever is necessary to make it happen. And in this case, we just can't deny the fact that there's enormous public support in Russia for Putin. I mean, it's not going to happen because the people of Russia rise up against him. And so if you're going to call for regime change, you better have in mind a strategy to make it happen, because otherwise you look weak. And I've always admired President Biden. One of the things he always used to say, both publicly and in private, when we were sitting in the Situation Room in the many years that I was there, was to say that great countries don't bluff, right? So don't say it unless you mean it. And if you mean it, and if you say it, mean it. And I think this is a case where and this is what the administration said, is that everybody would like to see Putin go, but don't say it's policy unless you actually have a meaningful strategy to make it happen.
As a diplomat, you might comment on what the American president said even less, but as a historian, I would like to ask you, might it not be necessary in this situation, in the still early 21st century, might it not be necessary to teach Putin and all other potential aggressors a lesson, teach a lesson such as George H.W. Bush did after the end of the Cold War with Saddam Hussein, or the other way around, as the great powers did not in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria. There was no real reaction from the international powers. And in the end, it opened the door for that whole decade, which ended up in the Second World War. So I know this teaching a lesson is unpopular amongst those who say we have to avoid escalation. And I perfectly understand these non-escalation logics. But again, the question, historically, might it not be necessary sometimes to teach a lesson?
Well, if you want to teach a lesson, you need the means to actually achieve what you announce you want to achieve. Very much to your point. How about looking at the sanctions we've already adopted? So we are in the midst of crafting the 5th sanction package. The first 4 sanction packages have practically excluded Russia from the international financial systems. Russian businesses and Russian state actors cannot refinance themselves anymore. The central bank is listed, as a number of other banks are. We have practically excluded Russia by dint of export and import controls from the benefits of globalization and from an economy that is based on the technology of the future. We have listed over 600 individuals that are close to Putin and play a role. We have taken a number of further steps. Listen, these are sanctions that are unprecedented. Certainly in the case of a country the size and the role of Russia, there will be more sanctions. We're going to get out of energy dependence entirely. The European Union announced, and we'll see how the discussions will evolve over the next days, that this will happen at the latest by 2026 and possibly even earlier. For my government, it will certainly be earlier. This is a massive shift for Russia. We already see the nosedive that the Russian economy has taken. It's a contraction of, I think, 11%, over 15%. It's huge in any event. So that is telling Russia loud and clear what the price is of a major violation of international law. Russia has been relegated to a pariah status. 141 nations in the United Nations condemned the Russian invasion, and 10 days ago it was 140 states. That's a huge majority. So my argument would be we are telling Russia loud and clear.
And I think, Andreas, it's important as we're sitting here at the NHTSA school and we think back to, there are different ways to teach lessons, right? And I sat for many years at the State Department with George Kennan and Paul Nitze looking down on me in my office in the policy planning staff. And we debated the same question during the early years of the Cold War. Should it be rollback? Should we do regime change in the Soviet Union? And a different strategy was adopted. And part of it was a function of the fact that the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, just as Russia has today. And so I don't think that the fact that we are sort of having a decisive regime change strategy or taking every risk to reverse this overnight necessarily means that we don't have a serious strategy to impose costs and to make clear that our determination over time that this shall not stand, as George Bush said in response to the Iraqi invasion.
I've got 2 questions regarding the relationships within Europe and within the European Union. So in a way, you can say Poland is back. Poland has changed from the European bad boy, undermining the rule of law, has changed to be a safe haven for Ukrainian refugees and the border states for EU as well as NATO. So what would you say, how will the war in Ukraine change the relationship between EU and Poland? And will this impact democratic backsliding in Poland and the standards within European Union? What do you think?
Look, Poland is playing a huge role in the refugee crisis. It has welcomed over 2.4 million refugees in Poland alone. Polish people have. They welcomed them in their homes. So there's no doubt that Poland is really shouldering a major burden in dealing with the refugee crisis, as other European countries are too, but Poland first and foremost. And yes, it's also true that the European Union had an issue with Poland regarding rule of law and regarding the justice sector. Both can coexist. It's not subject to political considerations or to, shall we say, opportunity considerations. It's just there, and we'll have to deal with it, and we'll continue to deal with it the way we partners do, the way families do.
And if I may ask you, what would you say about Hungary? We spoke about Serbia, the Balkan states wanting to join the EU before, and Hungary is behaving in a way close to Serbia with an at least dubious relationship with Putin, not aligning with Poland and Ukraine. So, would you comment on Hungary and what's going on there?
Well, let's get the priorities right. Hungary has supported each and every sanction package that we've adopted with regard to Russia lately. I may criticize policy issues, but for the moment, I'd focus on what we try to achieve, and that is crafting forceful sanction package, being sustainable about it, and being unified with regard to it.
Although all eyes are on Russia, and we have talked about all these questions in Russia, in Ukraine, in Europe, or regarding the transatlantic relations, although China remains a serious strategic threat to the West. Perhaps I'm a bit obsessed as a historian, but my fear would have been when Putin started to invade Ukraine, not being able to perceive that he just miscalculated. My great fear would have been something like a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact 2.0. So China invading Taiwan in the wake of Russia invading Ukraine. On the one hand, this has not happened. On the other hand, China is applying kind of neutrality and non-intervention. What would you say? What does the war mean for the future of EU-China relationship, of US-China relationship, and for this whole geopolitical constellation as regards China? I asked, first of all, I asked the China expert. I asked both of you, but first of you would have addressed you, Jim.
So, I mean, it's a great question, and I don't think we fully know the answers yet. I mean, there's a lot, as we were talking about, not knowing all the discussions and the conversations regarding the Kremlin. We certainly don't know what's really going on in Zhongnanhai, and you know, without trying to guess what the calculus was on the Chinese side, how much they knew in advance of Putin's intentions and the like, what conversations took place between the two presidents. I do think this poses an acute dilemma for China, because on the one hand, the Chinese have significantly thrown in their lot with the Russians as of a view that there needed to be a kind of a solid phalanx against the United States, and as U.S.-China relations became deteriorated, that Russia was an important counterweight to dealing with the problem of U.S.-China relations. On the other hand, the more that China is seen to be supportive of and condoning what Russia does, the more everybody else worries about China's own intentions. And so what it has done, as China has tried to walk this fine line on the one hand of not giving any comfort to the West, not giving any solace to the United States, not seeming to throw its partner under the bus, and yet recognizing that everything it does to seem to support Russia just convinces people that China must have similar intentions that Russia has. And so I think China has handled this poorly, but it doesn't have many good choices at this point, because it can't either abandon Putin, nor can it fully support Putin. And I think that the Chinese are confounded by the situation, but clearly have leaned, as they did back in 1949, towards Moscow. And I think that will have huge consequences over the long term. And I'll let the ambassador talk about EU-China relations, but certainly in the rest of the world. This has just reinforced the rest of the world's discomfort with the way that China sees the world and the choices that China is making.
I'm not a China expert, as you know. So I'll phrase it as a question. I do wonder to what extent China would even need the Ukrainian war template for Taiwan. It considers Taiwan as part of China. So it wouldn't, I assume, I would assume that China is much too inward looking, and it wouldn't look towards Ukraine as a model that could be followed in the case of Taiwan. It's simply happening in a different universe. But I agree with you that China has made a choice, and it has made a choice that is different than the choice it made in 2008 after the Georgian War, and it's different than the choice it made after the invasion of Crimea. Now, China, for the first time, has clearly and publicly said to the world that it supports the justification of the Russian aggression, by which I mean the justification and the legitimacy of spheres of interest. That's what China had publicly said. And it said it to NATO. It was talking about a country that is in the European geography. They told European countries, therefore, that Russia was right in claiming interest spheres. It was talking about European security. How can that not have an effect? Now, what I assume China is doing, I said it didn't, that I assume it doesn't need the Ukrainian template of an example of international law that could be mirrored in dealing with Taiwan. But it's studying very carefully the tactics, the reactions, the Western reactions, our responses, the sustainability of our response, our unity, our capacity to persevere. All of that are tactical informations that will be important for China. Also, it will study very carefully the effect of sanctions and the possibilities and the potential for circumventing them or for preparing in a proactive way for a situation where sanctions might be targeted against China. All of that it will look at closely. So the conclusion for us to infer is unity, perseverance, and a shared sense of purpose that will be crucial. It actually gives us power to impact on decisions that China may make in the future.
I still have got a bulk of questions, but I also would like to open up the podium. So Danielle, you are having a question, and then you, please.
Thank you. So we have a question from an online viewer. He's a SAIS fellow, Jonas Dreger. He asks, German policy towards refugees from Syria undertook various swings. So what developments do you expect regarding Ukrainian refugees, and how will this affect German policy toward the Ukraine conflict in the long run? I know, Ambassador, you talked a little bit about Poland's role with refugees, but where does Germany stand? Thank you.
Well, we have welcomed so far 300,000 refugees in the course of mostly 5 weeks. I assume the real number is much higher because you can, as a refugee from Ukraine, you can enter the European Union visa-free, and you needn't register. I think you're required to register after 6 weeks, so the real number will be higher. You're right in observing that there were fits and starts during the migration crisis in the German domestic conversation about the effects of integrating a huge number of refugees from an incredibly large area of origin. You just mentioned the Syrians, but that's really wrong. There were Syrians, but there were Iraqis, there were Moroccans, there were Somalians, there were people from the Afghans, there were Pakistan. They came from a huge area of origin, which made integration very difficult because we were confronted with different cultures, different languages, different trainings, etc. And even with cases where refugees were pitted against other refugees in reception facilities, all of that is very unlikely to happen now because the area of origin is actually limited. So I would not draw conclusions from the experience of the migration crisis 2015-16 for now. Also, so far at least, nearly all of the refugees in Germany, but also in Poland, that's what I hear, say, we want to return. Mm-hmm. We don't want to stay. Please make sure that we get lessons in Ukrainian. Make sure we get Ukrainian school books. We want to return. So that's yet a different context.
Please.
Thank you for being here, Ambassador. Appreciate your perspective. I have a question. Just it seems to me that Germany is policy towards this whole crisis has been obviously reactionary instead of proactive. The U.S. for years was kind of warning about the intertwined economic relationship and how this might come about. In the context of China, that's another authoritarian regime. Our government says it's committing a genocide. I think that VW has manufacturing facilities in the region where we say they're committing a genocide. I wonder, will Germany be more proactive in its economic relationship with respect to China that has similar characteristics to Russia? And then President Macron yesterday, I think yesterday, said that he was open to oil sanctions for Russian oil exports. And so I think we talked about red lines and all the rest, but what would it take for Germany to take that position? Because I guess by necessity, Germany would be more dovish than France on that issue. And so calling Russia a pariah, yet still buying their energy. I'm not sure how that squares.
Okay, to the first question. I think we all have taken leave from the concept that economic interdependence would make a country necessarily a responsible stakeholder. That hasn't happened in the Russian case, and we wouldn't say the same about China either. I would observe, though, that interdependence isn't just a German phenomenon. I believe that, and I'm sure you know that much better, America has invested heavily into China, even after Hong Kong, and the degree of your financial and investment in manufacturing is huge too. So what we have to focus on is less interdependence per se, but look where interdependence can actually harm or threaten our security. Which are the supply chains that affect sensitive ecosystems? Where do we have to make sure that diversification makes us either immune or at least less vulnerable. And that's something we're looking closely at along with the American administration in the G7 context, in the European context, because in the long run, we know that we have to make ourselves, well, immune from, in the context of economic relations that are very interconnected. To your second point, I think that's a very valuable point. And we're having a very difficult discussion. It has got moral features because, after all, Russian oil exports, or I should be saying the Russian exports of hydrocarbons, are financing the Russian war machinery. Oil more than gas, by the way, and certainly more than coal. But just for a moment, step back and imagine what it would mean for you if there would be a complete ban on imports of hydrocarbons. It would mean, in the American case, to stop, say, about half of your production of hydrocarbons in the United States. And just imagine what that would mean as a shock for American industry. Industries would close down. For households, for prices at the gasoline station. I'm not making an argument here. I'm just saying that if you take a decision, you better look at the implication, at all the implications of the decision. So if Germany would go cold turkey on hydrocarbons from Russia as of tomorrow, it would lead to the closure of the entire industries. It would mean huge price shocks. It would mean a major recession. And as Germany is the economic engine of the European Union, it would affect European countries too. And don't believe for a second that America would go unscathed. It would not. Germany is the fourth largest economy of the world. Of course, what happens in Europe and what happens in Germany would have an effect on the American economy too. Again, I'm not making an argument. I'm just saying that in the context of a very difficult moral, political, and economic equation, you have to look at all the aspects. And we live in democracies. And in democracies, you have to explain to your population what's in for them. And I said before, our political clout in the long run rests on our capacity to persevere, to actually follow through on sanctions for a long time. That's key for our success. And therefore, we'll have to factor in, if we do that, will that be sustainable? And what will be the long-term effects, including the knock-on effects that are difficult to predict? And here I'm talking about social and domestic political aspects. I hope you have noted, I've not made an argument. My only argument is, in very complex and difficult situations, look at all the aspects and be prepared.
Can I just quickly on this, because this is another important teaching moment, that it goes back to this question about interdependence, because it's a two-edged sword, right? Which is, on the one hand, interdependence can constrain, as we've seen here, because there are costs for us to be dependent. On the other hand, interdependence can give leverage, right? If countries are truly autarkic, you don't have much influence. So we have part of why we not succeeded with North Korea is because they're largely autarkic and they don't really, we have comprehensive sanctions, doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. And so it's a fine balance here. If you have no dependence, then you have no leverage, but you also have vulnerability. And this, of course, goes back to the discussion with China, because this is certainly one thing China is watching very closely, which is just how much pain are we prepared to suffer here and how much do we think it's worth it for Ukraine? Because this has certainly got to be part of the calculus. This is the one part of, I think, the Taiwan analysis which is relevant to this, which is, are you willing to go to $20 a gallon for gas for Taiwan? I mean, the equivalent of that, which it wouldn't be obviously oil and gas, would be other things that were dependent on China.
So pain and perseverance are not the brightest outlooks, but we do have to come to a close. And my last question would be to both of you. If you were granted one wish, Dean Steinberg, what would you wish from Germany?
I mean, I would wish to see perseverance, right? I mean, I think that this is the key here, that there just can't be any sense that, well, these are short-term measures and that we can only do this for so long. I mean, we have to lay the groundwork, and there has to be the public education that goes along with saying that this could last for a considerable period of time, because even if we get a resolution with respect to the situation on the ground in Ukraine, and I'm not predicting that, I have no crystal ball on how this is going to turn out, but that for reasons we talked about before, we just can't go back to business as usual. So having the public education, building the domestic public support for the strong positions that Germany takes is really the thing I think that's most important right now.
And if I finally might ask you, Mrs. Ambassador, what would you wish from the US?
A sustained and shared sense of purpose.
Thank you. So we did talk quite a lot about this Russian war in Ukraine, which is due to the circumstances and those, in fact, shattering times we are experiencing at the moment. I would like to say thanks so much for this really thorough debate. I think it was really a thought-provoking and inspiring discussion. So thanks so much, Dean Steinberg. Thanks so much, Ambassador Haber. Thanks to you for joining us here. And thanks to all of you who joined us wherever you might be at the screens. Thank you and have a great day. And let's hope all the best for what's lying ahead of us. Thank you.